Welcome to the Slow Money Club podcast, the show giving you realistic ways of attaining financial freedom. We share get-rich-slow strategies to help you go from employee to entrepreneur and turn your dreams into income streams. Now here's your host, Kwesi.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today on the Slow Money podcast. I'm delighted to be back again live on there. And for this episode, I've got a bit of a story to tell, I guess. Those of you who follow me on social media and on YouTube will have seen that I recently purchased a property at auction. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of the story behind that. I'm also delighted to be joined by the wonderful Piotr Rusenik. Now, he's somebody who actually helped me a lot through the process of buying at auction, because I'd never bought a property at auction before. And he's somewhat of a subject matter expertise in this field. So as I'm going to tell you a bit about my story, and he's going to add that bit of expert judgment and knowledge to it. So thank you very much for joining me today, Piotr.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kwasi, for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you and yourself and what's your background?
Yeah, great. Well, my name is Piotr Rusenik, and I'm Director of Synergy Property Partners, and I specialize in buying and selling properties in auctions and helping other people to buy and sell properties in auctions. And I've been doing that for a few years. That was my main focus for the few years. And prior to that, I was sourcing properties for clients, and so 7 years ago, I started working in properties actually by joining this boutique Central London sourcing agency, and I was learning how to source properties for clients in Central London, and I was doing that successfully around Paddington, Maida Vale, St John's Wood, and I slowly transitioned, set up my own business 5 years ago, and auctions are my main focus at the moment.
Oh, wow. So how did you get into auction? Because I'm assuming you said before you were sourcing property. It wasn't really auction related, I'm guessing.
Yes, so it was mostly I was going to agents and building a relationship with agents around Paddington, Maida Vale and St John's Wood. But obviously I was working for a boutique agency, and that was pretty much just me and my boss in the company. And he was dealing with auctions, and he taught me quite a few things on how to. Sometimes he would send me to an auction to buy something for a client, and he would set up everything. But I would go to the auction, I would raise my hands, and basically sometimes buy a property, sometimes not. But I got a lot of experience from that. It was like a quite hands-on training.
Yeah, sounds like it. And so before that, I guess, let's if we go back a little bit, you said you came from Poland originally. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm Polish. I came here when I was 19, came to the UK when I was 19, just after my A-levels. And one of my dreams was to study abroad. And I wanted to study actually in Scotland. So that was kind of one of my dreams. And I got accepted to university in Aberdeen, and I studied economics and finance. And I graduated in 2010 with first class honors. And actually, what I wanted to do after that is come to London and find a job in London. But I didn't want to find a job in a corporate environment. I wanted to work in a small company, and and meet people, network, and then find a job that way. And before actually coming to London, I went for a 10-day silent meditation retreat. And just before that retreat started, I started speaking with some people. I met this guy who worked in properties here, the property agency in London. And he offered me a job. So basically, then we went meditating for 10 days. And we met up in London, and that's how I sort of ended up working in properties.
So it was totally by accident?
Kind of accident, yeah, but a planned accident, yeah.
Yeah. But so you studied finance and economics. You didn't have any ambitions to go into banking or finance?
Absolutely not.
Why not?
it's just not my. I don't see myself in a sort of corporate environment and working. It's even I was put off by things like applying for jobs in banking, going through the application process and then assessment centers. Yeah. It's just something that it's just I can't go through those.
Yeah, no, okay, it can be very difficult and unnecessarily stressful.
Yeah, and I also myself was working for a small company and sort of trying to build things organically. And that's why I never really attempted at working in sort of banking or finance.
Yeah. So right from the beginning, from the get-go, you kind of landed in the property space. What did you think when you first began back then?
So I didn't really think much. It's I wanted to make some money to survive in London, and that was a way I was doing it. Properties can be super exciting, but then it can also be super disappointing when the deals fall through. So that's kind of something that I learned, and I learned how to deal with those sort of excitements and disappointments at the same time. And I also learned that I started working in 2011, and at that point, buying properties in London was kind of becoming popular again. It was after the financial crisis, but people still had doubts on sort of whether the prices would go up or not. But a lot of people that I was finding properties for were sort of Indian, UK-based Indian people with Indian background. And I would find them properties in Paddington and Maida Vale, so fairly central areas. And there would be ex-council properties, which would generate about 10% yield when rented to housing benefit tenants at that time. So it was a bit of a no-brainer. Even if the prices would go down in that area, you would still be getting like £30,000 of income, rental income, from a 300k property. So for many people, it was just a no-brainer. They would buy those properties. And now those properties in 2018, they're worth around 550, 600. So they doubled in prices. Obviously, the housing benefit doesn't provide as much income as it used to. But it just taught me how, it just taught me about taking risks. And if the property makes sense, it provides cash flow, and you're buying in a good area, it's difficult to lose in such a scenario.
Yeah, very, very.
So that was my key lesson.
It's very interesting. So yeah, for cash flow focused strategy, and you were doing that for clients mainly, is that right?
That's right. Yes.
And so these clients of yours were making a good yield at 10% back in 2011. What does that mean right now, though? So in 2018, as you said, the prices have doubled, but the income from social benefits is probably about the same. I don't think that's even risen with inflation. So would that?
Well, actually, it's much lower now.
So it's been reduced, and so the yield is that would have a double effect on the yield. Does that mean that today in 2018 that strategy doesn't work anymore?
No, it doesn't. It kind of stopped working 2012, late 2012, when the housing benefit rates went down. And they're calculated in a different way now. So, and there's a cap. So what works nowadays, obviously, the yields are low. So what works nowadays with those type of properties, sort of 3-4 bedroom flats in central London, is multi-letting them and renting them room by room if the lease allows for that, and if obviously the mortgage allows for that. And I guess this is what some of the people that I used to work with, that's what they do at this moment.
Interesting. Okay, so but going back to what you were doing back then, and you finished uni, you're working in property with somebody that you met at a retreat, and now what are you doing? What's your day-to-day look like?
So nowadays, my day-to-day is all about sort of looking at auction catalogs and trying to find good auction deals. And also I do have a lot of people sell properties in auctions, So a lot of people approaches me with, so when they have problems selling their property, or they just need to sell a property quickly, and they've never dealt with an auction house before. They come to me for guidance on how to do it. So actually today I was speaking with one of the clients who I'm helping find the right auction house for their property, and I'm also buying a property which I'm gonna put straight into auction, split it into two pieces, and put one of the pieces into the auction. So my days are quite varied, but it's all about looking at auction catalogs, speaking with auction houses, and yeah, that's mainly sort of what I do. And occasionally I also deal with tenants on the properties that I'm managing, chase them up for rents, and deal with the maintenance requests. So that's pretty much kind of what my day-to-day looks like.
Okay. There was a property that I was looking at, and I'd been following it in Rightmove for a little bit, and I'd even tried to buy it. And then one day turned up in my Rightmove alerts saying that it was going to auction. At this point, I didn't really have a view about buying at auction because, as you're saying, you deal with people who've never bought at auction like me. I'd never been to an auction even before that point. And so if somebody's going through that situation and they see something in a catalog or an auction catalog, what should they do? How should they begin?
Okay, well, it's a good question. There's quite a few things you could start with when you see a property in the catalog. So from my experience, like the things that I do is I would check whether the property was in the auction before, and if it was offered before, what's the property history basically. I would look at, it depends what type of property this is, but a lot can be found out through if there's property with planning applications submitted or approved. A lot can be found out from that. And I would just do a lot of desktop research on that particular property. So check the history, check whether there's any plans, what the legal pack is like, if that legal pack is uploaded. So before actually spending time on viewings and, I don't know, appointing solicitors or surveyors, I would do quite a lot of research using my laptop and using Google, using Rightmove, Zoopla, Essential Information Group, and trying to gather as much information as possible. And then once I'm fairly comfortable with the property, I would go and view it, and then take it from there, basically.
So before you do the viewing, you would have done a lot of research already before you. So you wouldn't. It was not like you would go to see the house and then if you like it or not, then go back and do some research on it.
No, I do it the other way around. So I do a lot of desktop research because I review about 400 properties every month. Wow. In the auctions, and I make a short list of properties that I like, and then out of that maybe there will be 30, 40 properties that I might initially like, and I'll do desktop research on those properties, and within 5 minutes I would basically cross out most of them, and I'll be left with maybe 5 properties which I might go and view, which I might go and do some more research on. So that's the way I work. If I wanted to kind of go and view all those properties, I would not have no time for anything else.
So then what kind of things are you using, criteria? What kind of criteria are you using to shortlist properties?
So there are certain properties that I like, and I know my investors would like as well. There's some mixed-use properties, and there's houses split into flats, and this could be high-yielding properties that might have some problems that we're able to sort out. So these are the kind of main categories. And then there will be things that if I see something in a catalog and I've seen another property nearby and I can see that actually this looks on the first look as a first sight as a good deal, then I would put out my short list and then do more research on that property.
Okay, so if you see something else locally that's maybe sold for more, and this has got a low guide price, and you think it could be a good deal, then that's one of the criteria you look at.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. When I was looking at this house, I guess the criteria I was looking at is that it met a lot of the criteria I was looking at in terms of the area, the size, the existing floor plan, and I had been trying to buy it. But when I went to the auction, I actually didn't go to the auction to buy. I just went there to have a look. And as the bidding was going on and happening around me, I realized that there was a lot of money being left on the table. So I joined the bidding. But what I hadn't necessarily done is prepared up front how I was going to pay for it, because I wasn't planning on buying a house. So in that sense, what would you suggest for someone who's going to an auction from a finance perspective?
Okay. Well, first of all, I would suggest no one else trying this the same way as you tried it.
I would too, for the record.
And I'm glad you were successful and sort of everything worked out well. But this is the preparation before buying the property is crucial, because essentially what you're doing in the auction is you are exchanging contracts and you're committing yourself to purchase the property, and you have to know what you're committing yourself to. And so I would basically suggest doing a lot of research in advance, and also speaking to professionals, obviously the solicitor, and possibly a bridging company, or a lender, or a mortgage broker for that sake, and also speaking to other investors, so someone who possibly have done a similar deal in the past, because there would be probably with an auction property, there might be some problems with it, and you want to kind of be in touch with people who've done similar deals to know how to overcome those problems. So with buying your property, have you come across sort of any problems?
Yes. Yes, I certainly have. I mean, the main issue, actually, which luckily I knew beforehand, I guess from my perspective, one of the reasons I had a bit more confidence in the bidding, although I didn't have the finance arranged, is that I had been through a conveyancing process on this house before in the past. So I knew, for example, that it had Japanese knotweed. So I know that as well that a lot of mortgage companies won't lend against a property with Japanese knotweed. In the first time round, I had looked into this, I had researched it, I had a mitigation for it. I know that there was a treatment program in place, it was insured, a few other things. So although I didn't have the finance, I did know a lot of the issues that there was underlying the property. And obviously I knew the house, I knew the area, I invested in the area, I knew what for that price, what yield I would be able to get from the property, etc., etc. But yeah, and to your point, I think there definitely was a problem, and that was the reason why it went to auction. And that was the Japanese knotweed issue, and the fact that actually the house was in disrepair. On YouTube, you'll see I'll link to it in here, but you'll see how the house looked, what we're having to do to the house. We're basically having to rip all the walls down, do an awful lot of work, probably more work than I thought, even than my builders thought when we first saw the house the first time around. So it definitely needs a lot of work. It definitely had its problems. And yeah, to your point, I agree with you. I think that if it's going to auction, there's probably some kind of issue that stops it being able to be sold in the, via an agent, for example. Yeah.
And those issues are fine as long as kind of you plan for how much it's going to cost to overcome those issues, resolve them, and just incorporate that in your price. And actually that's why I like auctions, because auctions allow for that, for kind of spotting what the problem is and then buying the property less the expenses needed to resolve issues.
You mentioned earlier on about legal packs. When you're looking at an auction legal pack, what kind of things do you look for?
So I would look at sort of the usual documents. I would look at the title documents first and see if there are restrictive covenants on the title, if there is anything unusual with the title, and possibly who's selling the property, whether that's a company or whether that's an individual, whether that's executors. Sometimes it's useful for making pre-auction offers. A certain type of sellers who would never accept pre-auction offer, and there are other private, for example, individuals who might accept pre-auction offer. So I'll look at title documents and make sure that there's nothing that prevents me from doing whatever I plan to do with the property, whether that's splitting it into flats or extending it or building another plot on the land. So that's one thing. And then definitely major document to look at are the special conditions. Because the special conditions, they basically, they're the most important documents in there. They would list all sorts of conditions that are attached to this property. There might be extra fees to be paid on completion. There might be a limited amount of time for completion. Instead of the usual 4 weeks, you might need to complete on the property in 10 days. And there are several things that can be put into special conditions that you need to be aware of in order to make sure that you price the property accordingly for yourself. Because if you need to complete in 10 days, you might have to use more expensive finance. You might have to also pay another extra fees to the seller on completion, and all those need to be incorporated in your figures before the auction, and you would get that from the special condition document. And then other things in the legal pack are the things like property information form, which the seller provides sometimes they don't provide it, and the local searches. And as much as looking at what's included in the legal pack, it's important to look at what isn't included in the legal pack, because that might give you a clue into what someone might try to hide. If, for example, there are no local searches, and then you might kind of ask yourself, is there any planning issues? Is there anything kind of adverse with that property that would make the seller not provide local search in with this property? So it's like looking at what is included in the legal pack and what that means, and also looking at what's missing from the legal pack that you would normally expect that might be a sign of the seller trying to not reveal all the information.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting way to look at it. I've never thought of it like that. Sort of what are they trying to omit and keep away? But yeah, interesting point.
Yeah, because I guess for the seller, like if you're selling a property and if you don't provide all the information, then you're not making yourself liable for like misrepresentation whatsoever. Yeah. But if you provide information that
is wrong,
kind of is wrong, or it makes the property look less attractive, then you're kind of paying for it, and you're putting people off. So sometimes sellers just don't provide information.
Yeah, I see. Okay, so when I got to the auction and I bid and I won, on the day you have to pay X amount, and then as you mentioned earlier, you either unless the special conditions say otherwise, you have something like 28 days to complete. So talk to us a bit about that process in terms of what you have to leave on the table on the day versus how long you have to actually stump up the rest of the money.
So when you are in the auction and you raise your hand, you win the bidding, and you go to the basically contract table, and at the contract table you need to pay usually 10% deposit. If it's a small property, there might be a fixed amount that you have to pay that's more than 10%, but usually it's 10% of the purchase price. And you also have to pay the auction admin fee, which is approximately, depending like on each auction house, but it's up to around £1,000 to be paid on the day. So it's 10% plus about £1,000 admin fee. And then you normally have 20 working days for completing on the purchase and providing the balance of the completion money. And 20 working days is 4 weeks. And if you don't complete in 4 weeks, normally you're being served a notice, which is a 10-day notice, and you have 10 days to complete on this transaction. So 10 working days, which is another 2 weeks. You have 10 working days to complete on that transaction, and if you don't, then you're losing your deposit, and you also can be sued for the losses to the seller, by the seller, basically. And on completion, you have to pay the balance of the purchase price, which is 90% of the purchase price, plus all the fees that are listed in the special conditions. So that could be seller's costs of selling the property, it could be seller's legal costs, it could be their searches costs. So those costs can add up to about sometimes 10,000-15,000 pounds. But there are certain type of properties and certain sellers who would try to put things like, on completion, you have to pay 5% of the purchase price as the seller's costs. So suddenly, on a 500,000 pounds property, you have to pay 25,000 pounds extra on completion. So you need to be aware of those things in special conditions. But this is pretty much the timeline of what you need to pay.
And so, the two things, I guess, the bit you mentioned there about the random stipulations of 5%, is that common?
It's, how common that is? Well, it could basically happen in an auction which got 100 properties. It might be there with 1 or 2 properties.
Okay.
So I don't know how common that is. Probably it's not common, but it can happen regularly.
So something to look out for. Good to know.
Yeah.
And I guess the other
thing on that contract on a certain day, and if you don't complete on the contract, then the seller cannot just automatically take your money. They have to serve you the notice, and that notice would typically be 10 working days, and from the day of serving the notice. So again, it's not an automatic notice. The seller has to actually serve it. And from that day of serving the notice, you have 10 days to complete on the transaction. And this is a typical 10 days. The special conditions can stipulate that you only have, instead of 10 days, you have 1 working day. So if they give you a notice, you might have to only 1 day to complete on the transaction, or 5 days, or 7 days. And that's why special conditions, again, are super important, because whatever condition is there, it would override everything else. Pretty much this is what it looks like. You might have some extra time to complete on your transaction, but if you don't complete by the time stated in the contract, it means that you will be liable for seller solicitor's cost of recalculating the completion money, and you will also be charged interest on the unpaid balance. So
that's interesting too. So they charge you interest on the 90% that's remaining.
That's correct. Yes. It's interest at around 3, 4, 5, 10%. Again, that would be stated in the special conditions.
Okay. Yeah. So that's good to know as well. When we talk about the legal pack and those documents, I mean, for the average person on the street, can they read these documents and understand them, or do they need to get a solicitor to review every legal pack?
Yeah, definitely. Any person can look at the legal pack and understand some of the information that are included in that. For example, things like title documents, they're pretty simple. They state who owns the property, what they paid for it, what the restrictive covenants, and typical title documents would be fairly easy to read. There might be some more difficult cases, but the way I work is I review the legal pack myself, and I try to understand it myself and how it affects what I plan to do with the property. And after that, when I know that this property is something I'd like to buy, after I understand the legal pack or the points that I could understand, I then go to a solicitor and ask them to review it. And I would state to them what I'm planning to do with the property, because that will affect how they're going to view the legal pack, what they're going to see in there. So I would say definitely anyone can review the legal pack, and obviously you'll need a solicitor to then kind of double check this for you and reconfirm some of the findings you've got, or highlight the issues that you have missed, and it's important.
And so then at which point do you get a solicitor to review the legal pack?
Once I'm happy with kind of what I've seen, and I'm happy that this property is close to basically at the moment that I'm thinking that I will have a chance of buying this property in the auction or before the auction, and
okay.
I'm fairly comfortable with what's included in there.
All right. Yeah. Understood. So as part of the research that we mentioned before, if it is something that you want to carry forward onto the shortlist, then you would get the solicitor to review the pack, see if you've missed anything.
Yeah, definitely.
The title, you mentioned the title, so and you mentioned as well that what the title says or who's selling it, whether it's a company, whether it's executors on behalf of a deceased, that can impact what you can do before the auction. Interestingly, the house that I bought at auction, I had tried to buy it previously because it was being sold by the executors of the will. And originally I wanted to do an exchange with delayed completion because there was nobody occupying the property. It was empty. That would have allowed me to do some work, buy effectively or refurb, refinance or finance. That didn't work because they pulled out, hence why that deal didn't go through. And it was exactly 12 months later, actually, that they went to the auction. But if in a similar scenario where a house is being sold by executors and you see that on the title plan as you review it, in the auction catalog, what does that mean? How can you benefit? How can you leverage that as an advantage?
So usually it's fairly difficult to deal with executors because you don't know how many executors are there. There might be some disputes between executors and or the people who are selling the property. So
I mean, yeah, I think that in my situation, that's exactly it. So one of them agreed to, the exchange and delayed completion to let me do the works, whereas others didn't want that to happen. So in the background, they were having their disagreements, and ultimately the deal fell through. But yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So sometimes it's like when I see executors, that the property is being sold by executors, I know there's small likelihood that this is going to be sold before the auction. It's not impossible, but the likelihood is limited. And when I see, for example, that it's a private individual that's selling the property and there's only one person kind of making the decision, there is a good chance they might take a pre-auction offer. And if it's, say, I don't know, a big company or it's a repossession, then most likely this is going to be sold in the auction room just for transparency reasons. And that's what it gives me when I'm looking at sort of who's selling the property.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think often I've seen as well, you might have like the local authorities selling properties at auction. So in those situations as well, you think that it's probably likely to go to the room and unlikely to sell beforehand.
Yeah, that's right, because the decision-making process is quite corporate. So if you try to purchase something before the auction, you make an offer. The offer is to go through some corporate bodies or like whatever way the council works. And even if they sell it before the auction, then there's no benefit to the person who's making a decision, whether that's sold before the auction or in the auction. And there might be actually a cost to them. They might be accused of loss of not being transparent, of whatever things. And if they just let it go to the auction room, they know, and everyone knows, it was a fully transparent sale, and no one was basically trying to do anything dodgy. So usually councils, they prefer selling in the auction.
Okay. So taking a step back a bit, once you've looked at the property or you've shortlisted a property and you want to go for a viewing, talk me through that bit. of your process in terms of how you go about the viewing? Are there things you look for in particular, given how much research you've already done up front? And I think the second part to that question is, would you go to auction to bid for properties that you haven't even viewed because, you have such an extensive research approach?
Okay, so sometimes there would be situations where I would bid on a property that we haven't seen. It could be a commercial property which is rented on a long-term, fully repairing lease, and it could be a tenanted property in a block of flats which has got sort of a good, good rental. Good rental, and obviously a good track record of the tenant, and it's got fully up-to-date accounts for the service charge. There shouldn't be anything wrong with a property like that. So there could be situations, but I tend to always see the property before bidding on it. And the way I go about the viewings is I look at the kind of major things, such as if it's a house, are there any structural problems with it? Do I see any problems like with the roof, for example? Inside, if it's unmodernized, do I need to? I look at the utilities basically. Are the electrics kind of fairly new, or would we have to rewire the whole house? What's the boiler like? Is the gas central heating, and what condition it is? And so there would be major things like that. And then I would also look at the kind of possible problems, like is the floor, for example, uneven? Is this something normal, or is it looking suspicious? Is there any problems with the garden? I don't know. Is it Japanese knotweed, or is it overgrown? Has it been recently cut, for example? And that might suggest there might be something to hide with it. I recently have a client actually who bought a property, and in front of that property there was a car parked, right? And there's a tree next to that car, and basically that car was parked there. And when she completed on the transaction, the car was removed, and she realized there's a big crack in the driveway, and that crack is caused by the tree that's
wow.
in the house. So
yeah.
It's obviously you need to be aware of things like if there's a big tree, there might be some problems because the roots might be reaching the house and stuff. So I look for this kind of unusual things. Obviously, there's always things that you can miss, but checking for things like that. And there might also be things like if the property was altered, like for example, there's no chimney breast, I would try to establish whether there's in the legal park, whether there is building regs certificates for removing that chimney breast and supporting the structure of the building. There's several different things. So when I do the viewing, I make sure that I then try to link back to the auction catalog and see if everything matches, or if there's evidence for certain things in the legal park.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then in terms of once you've been to the viewing, you've seen the property that you like, and you go to the bidding itself, do you have a strategy or an approach that you use to make sure that you get the property for the best price? I mean, when I was there, I wasn't planning on bidding, so I didn't enter the bidding until actually the auctioneer was already counting down and ready to hit the gavel, and that's when I entered. If I hadn't joined, it probably would have gone for about, 15 grand less than what I ended up paying for it. But I didn't necessarily have a strategy for bidding. It was just at a price point that I thought was too cheap. So do you go in as an expert, do you go in with an actual strategy to try to help you get the property for the lowest price possible?
There are certain things that you can do in order to make sure that you are confident in bidding, but ultimately it's going to be up to the other buyers in the room whether you're going to get this property or not. because I go into the room with a price in my mind that I'm willing to pay for a property, and that's the maximum that I would go to. There might be a little allowance for sort of going over a certain price, but I try not to sort of exceed whatever I set myself to go there for. And when the bidding happens, obviously, a lot of the things that happen need to be done before the auction. So I need to make sure that I'm comfortable and confident with what I've done. Once I'm in the auction, I basically just wait for the bidding. I'm usually at the back of the room because I want to see what's happening in the auction room and who I'm bidding against. And there is a strategy sometimes with very cheap properties of just shouting the price, basically. Instead of going with what the auctioneer suggests every 5k or every 10k, you just shout the price that you want. And it could be a much higher price than what someone is offering at that given point in the auction room. But if you shout that, it just kind of displays a bit more confidence, and it might put other people off from bidding and trying to overbid our price. So that's one thing, and I'll definitely make sure that I'm always at the back of the room, and I try to be in control of the bidding and not let the auctioneer kind of dictate of what I have to bid. But then it only goes as far as sort of other people's bidding, because if they are willing to pay way over what we want to pay, no strategy is good enough.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, stay at the back so you can observe and try to be in control of the bidding where possible, but you can't necessarily control the room.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
And right, definitely, like, the main strategy is like sticking to the price that you have in mind and your Excel spreadsheet suggests, because this is ultimately what's gonna get you to win. Even if you end up not buying the property, you actually won, because you are not going to lose money, and that's
and that's
important.
Such a good point. It's such a good point. For me, going into that auction, as I said, the price at that point was well below, because on my Excel spreadsheet, I had already bid for this house and I had actually a much higher figure in mind. At that point in the auction, I think it was about 80k below the price that I'd already agreed with the vendors the first time round. Yeah. So I knew that there was the value there. I knew I'd done my analysis, and I knew that I was still coming in well below the price that I was actually willing to pay for this property. So that all made me confident. And to your point, there was another bidder at that point who was kind of going back and forth, but I was so confident at that point. I just kept my hand up. I didn't even put my hand down as it was going up. I just kept my hand up and said, whatever, just keep going. I should have done what you said though and just shouted out the numbers, but then again, I might have ended up paying a lot more than I did pay if I had done that. So.
Well, any strategy that gets you to buy a property for a good price is a good strategy. So I might add that. Exactly. I might add that strategy to my portfolio.
Okay. So I think now what I want to do is I'm going to ask you just a series of quick fire questions as we wind this interview down. You can answer them how you feel, but I'll give you a few questions that people often ask me anyway, and see what you think. But
sure.
So why buy properties at auction?
Because there are opportunities to buy properties for low price, and the process is super quick. Even if you don't end up buying the property, you only lose 3 or 4 weeks of your life, and not 6 months or 12 months. And these are the main points.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I bid a year before it went to auction. That took about 6 months, 7 months, and then fell through. When I ended up buying it at auction, within 4 weeks, I had the keys.
Yeah.
Within probably another 2 months, all the work will be done. And yeah, it's definitely a lot quicker.
Yeah.
So next question. What are the downsides of buying at auction?
The downsides of buying in the auction is that you need to have finance prepared in advance. You need to be basically either cash rich or have access to funds, bridging funds, which cost more money than mortgage, basically. And also you might end up with certain things that are hidden, and there will also be problems with properties. A lot of properties in the auction have problems, not all of them, but most of them. And you need to be able to solve those problems. And that might take some time, might take some skill, it might take some money. And the downside is if you don't prepare yourself for that, you may lose quite a significant amount of money, or you may not make as much money as you planned yourself to make. So I would say this is the main downside. What else? And also the process can be quite emotional. A lot of people kind of get very disappointed if they don't end up with the property, and they may also get, I would say, overexcited when they're trying to buy a property. So there's that emotional roller coaster, which you just need to kind of control yourself in that environment.
Especially if you don't have the funding arranged beforehand. I can testify to that.
Yeah.
It's a massive roller coaster.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question is, what are the costs?
The cost of buying or the cost of selling?
Both.
Okay. Well, the cost of buying is obviously the purchase price of the property, and then all the associated costs that are in the special conditions. So there might be things like I said before, solicitor costs, seller solicitor costs. There might be seller's cost of selling the property, the searcher's costs, and some additional potential costs. And then you also have to pay for your solicitor to review the legal pack before the auction. You'll have to pay for potentially a surveyor if you're not confident enough with the state of the property. And there might be some extra costs that you might be required to pay for professional advice before the auction. So I would say you can spend about 1,000 to 1,500, even 2,000 before the auction, before you even buy a property, in order to get yourself to the point of being able to buy it. And if you're selling the property in the auction, there would be costs. There are two main costs, basically. The auction entry cost, which is anywhere from £600 to £1,000, and that's paid up front. And then there will be a cost of your solicitor preparing the legal pack, which is about £1,000 to £1,500. And you have to pay for the searches. So normally the buyer orders the searches, but because you're selling in the auction, you need to provide the buyers with everything. You have to pay for the searches, which is a cost of about £350. So in order to basically put the property into the auction, you need to pay upfront about £2,500 to £2,500. Plus, there's a cost of a commission to the auction house on successful sale, which is anywhere from it could be 2%, it could be 2.5%, it could be 3%. Depends on the type of property and the reserve price also you're committing yourself to.
Actually, you mentioned reserve price. What is the relationship between the guide and the reserve price?
Yes, so as per Advertising Standard Agency, the guide price should be within 10% of the reserve price. So, for example, if the reserve price is £100,000, the guide price should be within 10% of that. So, between around £91,000 to £110,000. And normally the guide price is below the reserve price in order to attract people into the bidding. So if the reserve is £100,000, I would expect the guide price to be between around £91,000 to £100,000. And you need to remember that the reserve price is something that's flexible. It's not revealed to the public, but it could be changed before the auction. So if someone commits to a reserve price at the point of entering the property into the auction of £100,000, but then there isn't enough interest in the property, they might actually reduce the reserve price to 95, before the auction, a day or two before the auction, and the guide price will need to reflect that change. So sometimes you see the properties with a reduced guide price, so that's probably reduced because of the reduction in the reserve price.
I think those are actually very important points that you make. So if you see that the guide price has been reduced, then it's likely that the reserve has been reduced as well.
Yes.
And if there is a guide price and you add 10% to that guide price, that's likely the reserve price or the maximum reserve price.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that valuable note, thank you very much for your time today, Piotr. You know, it's always good talking to you, and you've got so much insight into this. I think you should tell people how they can contact you if they want to find out more.
Yeah, definitely. Well, people can connect with me through LinkedIn. My name is Piotr Rusenik, and I'm sure you're gonna post it on the title or somewhere within your podcast. So you can go with LinkedIn, Facebook, and also can find my details on the website, www.synergy-pp.com. And these are the main points. And also, I'll be writing a book about auctions. Actually, I teamed up with a very knowledgeable auction manager, Jay Howard, and we're going to be writing a book about auctions, which is probably going to be released around January 2019. So I'm going to be sharing the knowledge within the book as well.
Awesome. And I look forward to having you back when the book comes out to talk a bit more about it.
Phenomenal. I'll be pleased to come again.
All right. Great. Well, thank you very much. And, you know, as always, my pleasure. And thank you for joining us on the Slow Money Club.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like more information on what you just heard, go to slowmoneyclub.com and join the club. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever app you use. And please also give us a 5-star review. That way, you get the latest episode on your phone as soon as it's released. You also help other people discover this podcast too. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on the Slow Money Club.